ladies and gentlemen, to everyone here at the State Library of Victoria and also to our online audience. And welcome to our event previewing the year ahead, what 2025 holds for Australia in the world. As is customary, we begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'm Sam Roggeveen, Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, and with me on the stage this evening are Jennifer Hewett from the Australian Financial Review and my colleagues from the Lowy Institute, Dan Flitton and Lydia Khalil. I'll introduce all of them more formally in a moment, but first, just to briefly set the scene for this evening, I want to say at the outset that as moderator for this conversation, I'm going to be doing my best to make sure that the next hour is not just a Trumpathon. Inevitably, the US administration is going to impinge on our discussions, but we're in the very early days of a new presidency when the administration is free to set the agenda and when events have yet to impose themselves. That time will come though, and when it does, we may look back and ask whether we didn't spend a bit too much time worrying about this one problem and too little thinking about the others. Now, that's not to minimise what's emanating from Washington right now, but just to add a caution about the difficulty that we all have in removing ourselves from the parochialism of the present, as it's sometimes called. None of that, I should also caution, means that the people up on stage get a free pass from making sharp observations and a few risky forecasts. This afternoon, I asked ChatGPT to tell me what Australia's foreign policy priorities will be in 2025, and it reeled off a familiar list, and then it closed with this line: addressing these challenges requires a nuanced approach that balances economic interests, national security, and ethical considerations in Australia's foreign policy. Yeah, no kidding. So I think we can do better than that this evening. And we'll need your help too, of course. Later this hour, we will come to you with your questions. But first of all, to help us survey the scene and offer their thinking about the year ahead, three analysts of global affairs with me on the stage, all of whom also keep an eye trained on what it all means for Australia. Jennifer Hewett, to my immediate left, is National Affairs columnist for the Australian Financial Review. She writes a daily column on politics, business and the economy. Dan Flitton is managing editor of the Lowy Institute's magazine, The Interpreter. Previously, he was diplomatic editor and senior correspondent at The Age, and he worked as an analyst in the Office of National Assessments. And at the end, Lydia Khalil is director of the Transnational Challenges program at the Lowy Institute. She manages the Digital Threats to Democracy project, and she's the author of Rise of the Extreme Right, a Lowy Institute paper published in 2022 on global right-wing extremism. Could you please make them all welcome? Thank you very much. And as promised, we're going to start at home. We're not going to start with Trump. And Jennifer, because you're our guest, but also because you are the super plugged-in national affairs correspondent for Australia's best newspaper, I wanted to start with you about the election, and you're going to tell us in an exclusive the date of the Australian federal election, and then tell us a little bit more about what, if any, foreign policy themes that we're going to see in the election campaign.
Well, I'm afraid I can't be very precise about the date, in part because I don't think the Prime Minister can yet be precise about the date. And so there have been all sorts of ones floating around, and they all seem to have slight problems. One was, the common one for a while was April 12, but then that's the beginning of Passover, the school holidays, and April 5, and maybe that's to do with the WA election. And so in the end, we may end up in more of this kind of agony and false fake campaign, phony campaign, through till May, I'm afraid to say. But I think in a sense though, that's kind of less significant than the themes of the campaign, which I think we can already see. And they're going to be, of course, very domestically focused. And you've heard it over and over and over again, and I'm afraid you're going to hear it more. Cost of living, cost of living, cost of living, and who's responsible for that. I must say I'm not particularly looking forward to it as a inspiring campaign from either side. But that will be, you know, the whole talk about I think the Labor Party will be talking at length about how much it's done for people, all its cost of living measures, and how the opposition would be mean, and take away all these things, and how everybody would be worse off. And the Liberals will talk about how terrible the Albanese government has been, and basically made Australians feel less safe and less economically secure. So not particularly inspiring, as I said. In terms of the foreign concept of that, obviously, particularly when you've got an issue, a president like Trump, hate to say this and break the anti-Trump thing, but we're going to have to talk about him.
I've got a clock here in front of me. We're 6 minutes in, and that was the first.
I do think a lot of that will mean that it's going to be, what his policies are going to take up a lot more space in the domestic election campaign. Won't necessarily affect the results, but there'll be a lot more talk about it. And then in terms of the other, China is certainly hasn't fallen off the radar, but in terms of people's domestic concerns, it's not as quite as much of an issue as it was, obviously, when you only had the tariffs on. But then that all may change again because of what happens with tariffs and China and trade. And of course the other issue which will play through all the way through, I think, will continue to be Israel and the rise of anti-Semitism in Australia and how the domestic politics of that are playing out.
But Dan, I wanted to follow up there on China in particular. I think you'd agree that the opposition's tone on China has been different under Peter Dutton. So do you want to say anything about that and more broadly about what Jennifer has just told us about the election campaign?
No, it is a fascinating question. I mean, Jenny was an old rival, so I couldn't help but break some news when I came here tonight. I mean, you might have seen as we were coming in that Trump has said, well, the tariffs won't apply to Australia provided that Australia becomes the 51st state. Now, I'm joking, of course, but do you really think it could be that far from reality? That's the sort of strange times that we're living in, that we could actually have to, perhaps not that particular example, but we could have to contend with some strange circumstances. The China question is really fascinating because while you could say that the coalition has dialed back some of its rhetoric, I don't know that it's so much an issue on the Australian side as to the choice that China itself has made in order to be nice and be friends with Australia. So I think when Albanese was elected, that China saw that there was an opportunity for them to have a circuit breaker and to mend the relationship. It took time, and Australia talked a lot about stabilisation, and that was perhaps a test that Beijing was giving. But ultimately it was Beijing that opened the doors and allowed Australia back in. And I'm not sure that they would shut them in the face of a Dutton government, but it is an interesting question as to which countries might prefer either a Labor or a Liberal-led government in Australia. And I think, Jenny mentioned Israel, I think that we know that the Israeli government would be more comfortable with the coalition approach to foreign policy. I think that China would probably prefer Labor at this stage. But having said that, I don't think that they're going to slam the door in the face of the coalition. A really interesting test in this might be something like EV vehicles, which China is exporting at great numbers to Australia, but the United States has effectively blocked EVs coming to the United States, and they've started to raise security concerns, which are being echoed here in Australia, about these EV vehicles. So that could become a real test in the relationship if there's a change of government.
Now, as the chair, I'm going to limit my own editorial interventions here, but because we're on this question, I did want to briefly address defence policy in the election campaign, and I think this is a dog that's not going to bark. AUKUS, despite how controversial it is, I think, in the community, will not be a huge election issue, I predict, simply because there is bipartisan consensus on this question. I thought I would recommend a column written by the Australian's foreign policy columnist Greg Sheridan, I think on the 20th of January, where he effectively said that the two major parties collude on AUKUS, not just because they both agree that they want to do it, but collude in the sense that both of them, secretly acknowledge that this is not going to happen, that the plan to acquire submarines from the United States in particular is totally unrealistic, and that it's in both their interests to continue to speak confidently about AUKUS and to not admit that the plan to acquire these submarines is unrealistic and unlikely to come to fruition. I recommend that column, and I'll say no more on the topic, but hand over to Lydia now, because I wanted to stay on the topic of democracy and elections, because we just had a huge year of elections, right, around the world in 2024. So can you, in your capacity as, you're a researcher, I should say, who's worked a lot on democratic trends and, excuse me, developing a new index that measures democratic erosion around the world. So tell us a little bit about the year we've just come through and what might happen in 2025 to global democratic trends.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So, we note to say that 2024 was dubbed the year of elections, not necessarily the year of democracy. And I think that brings up two points for me in that year. So we had about half the world's population, a little bit less than 80 countries participate in elections in 2024. And of those countries, I think roughly about 20% of them were not democracies. So they were like straight up autocracies like Russia. Russia had an election. There were other kind of mixed regimes as well that had elections. And so what does that say? Why would autocratic governments why would Putin bother to have an election? And I think that points to a couple of things. One is the legitimizing power of elections, even when they're not free and fair. They're still important, even in kind of closed regimes. And the second thing that highlights in terms of the number of countries is that not all elections lead to democratic outcomes. So they can either help consolidate democracy or they can help erode it. And I think if you take a look at the year of elections in 2024, you have a decidedly mixed picture. So you've got some instances where, whether it was through the process or whether the candidates themselves that were elected contributed to democratic erosion in those countries, or a wobbling of democratic norms in those countries. And you can point to examples like United States, sorry, I've got to say it, with Trump, potentially Indonesia as well. But then you look at other countries where the process of going through elections did help consolidate some of the democracies. So we can point to India in that regard, Senegal, that fended off a coup attempt by its incumbent president. But even in elections that were not free and fair, like in Venezuela, where the incumbent still retained power, like Maduro, he was so delegitimized through that election that it helped to bolster the democratic opposition. So mixed bag. And I'd say in terms of the results of those elections, what are the broader trends? Well, one is anti-incumbency. That was very clear. I think the Financial Times had a piece where they said, in all of the countries that had elections, every single governing party lost voter share, and that was the first time that happened in history. So whether or not they lost the election, many of them did, but they all lost voter share. And the second was, again, with the exception, I think, of the UK and India, maybe a couple of others, is this leaning toward the far right parties and populism. We see that most evocatively in the United States. And I guess the question for me going forward is that indicative of this kind of grievance-based feeling that we all have this dissatisfaction with democracy that will pass, or is it going to consolidate into some serious authoritarian, anti-democratic, dare I say, leaning into fascist momentum going forward? And I think that's yet to be seen.
Just a quick follow-up on that. One sort of little kernel nugget of hope that I've always had about the trend towards far-right populist parties and leaders is that none of them are particularly good at governing. Do we have evidence yet, or do we know much about whether the public that votes for these far-right parties actually stick to them after they get a chance to run things?
Well, I think we might not have a clear picture on that, because when they do come into power, they erode democratic norms and procedures even further, that it doesn't give a chance for the public to to have a kind of a legitimate and clear say. So, again, I think what those results are also saying is that whether it's that anti-incumbency trend or that shift toward populism, what it's saying, though, is that at least our expectations of what democracy can deliver has greatly diminished. So I think that that's clear in terms of, redistributive policies, greater equality, all of our expectations of what we think democracy can deliver. Even though there's hope for a lot of, through what we saw in 2024, that expectation has been tampered, and we'll see if that comes up. And that plays into your question about if the expectations are low, then what does that mean?
Well, I don't actually think it's quite as dire as that. And for example, if you look at what's happened in Italy, and you had Meloni dismissed as a far-right leader, and in fact she's become incredibly popular and is regarded as pretty competent. So, I think that kind of goes against that trend. And the other thing that I think, despite your fears, and I understand, for example, Trump's willingness, obviously, to usurp and exert power, against many of the institutions in the US, for example, we'll see how that plays out. But a lot of the move has been the pendulum swinging. And what is, it's democracy if people say, no, actually, we don't want the type of immigration we've had, and we don't feel we've been getting a fair share. Well, it's, you can call that popular and right-wing populism, or you could just say that's democracy.
Yeah. Dan, I want to bring us back to our neighbourhood and Australia's place in the Pacific. This has been an increasing area of attention really since the Turnbull government, the Step Up, as it was dubbed at the time, and then reinforced by Morrison. Talk us through some of the most recent developments, and I think actually the Trump cuts to US aid, I think, are going to be felt in the Pacific, right?
Yeah, very much.
But more broadly about the year ahead in the Pacific and Australia's place in that region.
Yeah, it's a tough one for the election. In 2022, if you remember, Solomon Islands signed a security deal with China, which at the time set off, I think panic stations is probably too strong a term, but there was a lot of concern, particularly in Canberra, about what this meant, and there was a race to try and shore up Australia's relationship with the region. But the Labor Party had an effective line at the time, which they deployed, saying it was the biggest foreign policy muck-up of the century, or something to that effect. It's perhaps calmed down a little bit now in terms of the contest between China and the United States through those years. But you remember last year during the Pacific Island Forum, there was the hot mic moment where Anthony Albanese and Kurt Campbell, who was then a senior advisor within the White House, Kurt Campbell said something to Albanese along the lines of, "We've given you the lane, take the lane." That went down pretty poorly in the region, been seen as Australia and the United States sort of working together against China, but it was perhaps against the regional interests as well. But I think one thing to bear in mind too is that in the last 5 years, Australia, with our biggest neighbour in the Pacific, PNG, Papua New Guinea, Australia has provided $3.1 billion in both budget support and loans to PNG. It's a huge amount of money, and yet PNG's development statistics are among the world's worst in a lot of ways. They've had outbreaks of polio again in the not that recently. 50 years it's been. This year will be the 50-year anniversary since PNG's independence, and yet it is still a very much aid-dependent country. And there's the other issue of what happens with Bougainville, which has voted some years ago now to become an independent nation itself, and that still hasn't been worked out. So there's flashpoints around in PNG which are really concerning. But what has happened, and the reason I mentioned the money, is what's happened is that the contest that used to be played out, and we used to be quite critical, Australia used to be quite critical of China and Taiwan for playing checkbook diplomacy in the Pacific, We're now very much playing checkbook diplomacy in the Pacific in our contest with China. But it's also it's something that goes back further when we went and waved the checkbook around so that we could have somewhere to dump asylum seekers that we didn't want coming to Australia at the time, or to come up with a solution to the issue of asylum seekers, I should say. But those sorts of issues have affected the way in which Australia is dealing with the region. And to come back to Trump, maybe one of the, I don't think intended, but the positive consequences of Trump freezing US aid is that it'll actually take away the incentives for bidding wars between one side and the other.
Well, I think it'll just make it easier for China, won't it?
It might make it easier for China, but it also takes away some of China's incentive, because frankly, while it's fairly cheap for China to go out and offer some of the money in the region, if there's not a choice for the Pacific, because the Pacific, you forget, the Pacific have agency in all of this as well, and can play one side off against the other. So it becomes cheaper for China, maybe.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean there's any less interest in doing it.
Yeah, I don't think that they'll have quite the same incentive if they're not putting it against us.
Yeah, I think we also tend to underestimate how, the Lowy Institute, in fact, has been tracking aid trends in the Pacific for many years now, and China's aid spending levelled off in around 2016. And although I think this is commonly misunderstood, Australia's aid effort in the Pacific Islands region is significantly larger than that of China.
Yeah, but are you talking about investment? What about investment?
No,
China's investment?
I'm not talking about investment.
So that's a different thing.
Yeah, indeed.
Sam, while we're on the topic of aid, Sam, I just want to make a quick plug actually to an upcoming Lowy Institute podcast that's coming out tomorrow with some of our colleagues, and they're talking specifically about the implications of this USAID freeze. So give it a listen. I think it'll be great.
Yeah, there's already reports coming from all corners of the world about how difficult that has been. So, Jennifer, let me come back to you now and ask you about a broad trend that we've been thinking and talking about now for several years, which is the erosion of the free trade agenda, the multilateral free trade agenda, and the rise of economic nationalism. That's been apparent for some years. It's certainly come home just over the last 24 hours or so with news that the Trump administration is preparing to impose global tariffs on steel and aluminium. So I wanted to ask you the implications for Australia. I assume you're writing about this for your column tomorrow, so maybe you can give us a sneak preview.
Well, again, I wish I knew, because I don't think anybody does. This was done, of course, with typical Trumpian panache, which means just having a kind of a completely off-the-cuff press conference. Nobody's entirely sure what he means. There's details to come later. There's no official announcement. He's talking about reciprocal tariffs. Does that mean that Australia will be off the hook? Nobody really knows. But what you can't alter is the fact that he has a very, very strong belief in tariffs as the answer to any of America's problems, or many of America's problems, including its budget deficit. It doesn't matter what the economists say, that this will all be counterproductive. That's what he believes. It also doesn't mean, however, that he may not change his mind. And he would certainly change his mind, for example, if markets, I think, start to react really, really badly. So far they haven't, and let's face it, the stock markets are, close to record highs. So he's looking good. He's kind of quite enthusiastic about it at the moment, because there are no kind of obvious costs to this, and he can fulfill his campaign promises. I just think it's going to be a very, very rocky road, and nobody will know. In terms of domestic politics, of course, this is a mixed blessing, I think, for the opposition, in the sense that Trump is Dutton is more likely to kind of align himself with Trump policies more openly, and yet Trump is obviously not going to be popular in Australia, and if this plays out, that's not going to work well either. At the same time, Albanese has to demonstrate that he can, stand up for Australia's interests or something, whatever that means. It's very, very uncertain, and as we've seen with Canada and Mexico, they've got a pause on tariffs at the moment, but who knows what will happen in a couple of weeks. I just think it's going to be a very wild ride for a while. I think the momentum will change eventually. I think at the moment we're seeing kind of peak Trump doing whatever he wants, and there's no fight back anywhere.
But so let's come back to the election campaign then. I talked about a global movement away from globalisation and economic globalisation and trade. But has that has been apparent at the margins in Australia? With the podcasts I listen to, I occasionally hear ads from the Australian government for a Made in Australia campaign.
Yeah.
There's a bit of that about, but it's kind of marginal, right? So Australia is sticking to its free trade guns?
Well, it is. But, I think we've done, the Albanese government in particular kind of picked up on the COVID thing about supply chains and how dangerous it was to be kind of totally reliant, and this fitted, I think, with their other kind of agenda, which still has a kind of a labour kind of shibboleth in many ways, which is manufacturing jobs are better than any other jobs, and we don't make enough things in Australia, and that often kind of reflects this idea that you can kind of go back to a very manufacturing-based economy, which I don't think is correct. Anyway, that kind of fits with some of their agenda. So that was certainly there to some extent. Of course, the whole Made in Australia routine and the talk that we're going to have billions of dollars of investment, things haven't gone quite according to plan. So, but what we'll see now is I think, how this washes out. What's going to have much greater impact is the prospect of a kind of trade war. It was always against China, increasingly so over the last, really since Trump came in at the first term. But I think it's just going to become more intense now.
There's just two real quick points to add to that, though. You mentioned AUKUS before, Sam. What's really interesting about AUKUS is that the government doesn't very often, or if at all, make the case for AUKUS submarines on the basis of the strategic environment in which Australia finds itself. It's much more about a domestic jobs building enterprise, and South Australia being the locus of this. And so that kind of goes to your point about the shift. And this is sort of the discomfort that's still felt, I think, in Australia about having let go the car industry and this idea in which we want to build things here. And that's one point. But the other is something that Jenny Gordon wrote for me. Jenny Gordon's an economist who is at the ANU, and she's a visiting fellow at the Lowy Institute. And she wrote a really good piece last week, the headline of which has been overtaken. Will Australia be in the tariff firing line? Okay, yes, we are. But Jenny makes a very good point in this, which I'm stealing and acknowledging only because we're also being broadcast. But Jenny's point is that there is a flip side to the assumption that Australia can seek an exemption in all of this, which is troubling, which is what are we giving up in order to get the exemption? And it's the sort of principal aspect that she's driving at in all of this. Why are we going along and going to play with Trump's game on the tariff issues? And what does that mean more broadly if we all end up, and I mean, this is just the point about the fear that people have about a tariff war, is that we'll all end up doing these little secret trade deals with one another.
Did you want to? No.
No,
I was just going to point out, actually, to give us all a sense of a little bit of confidence about that, the picture that you paint, which is that Australia responded incredibly well to the economic coercion measures that China put in place that have come off over the last, that came off over the course of last year, in particular after the Albanese government was elected. And it's because we have an open and globalised economy that our exporters were able to find new markets for their exports, and so you would hope that that in a more intense trade war, Australia could respond similarly well. So the answer is not to onshore. The answer is to double down
But I mean, Australia also got away with that as well as for what the reasons you're mentioning, and also got away with because economically, because China still wanted iron ore and coal. So the big issues were still pumping out. So that kind of provided a great economic buffer.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just, I don't feel like I'm jumping in again, but that's just one other thing that we need to think about is what happens if the Americans ask Australia to make a sacrifice in its competition with China. So the trading relationship that Australia has with China is such an important part of our economy. The Americans could ask us to effectively self-harm. Why are we, Australia, providing the basis by which China can become very rich and a competitor to the United States? I could see them making that argument in Washington, and this is part of the question about whether your Kevin Rudd is there. Is he able to hold up his end of those sorts of arguments?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's where you really get to the nub of that issue of whether Australia ever needs to choose between the US and China. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very important point. But let me move now to the Middle East, Lydia, and ask you on your other area of expertise. Can you give us a regional survey, if you like? That's a big question to ask you. But the major regional players: Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel. After a hugely tumultuous year, how do you summarise all of that, and what is in store for us this year?
You're giving me the easy region, Sam. I'll do my best to keep it short. So, you're absolutely right. 2024 was like a massive year in the Middle East. Not just tumultuous, but I think fundamentally environment shifting in terms of the regional order. So hugely consequential. And of course, that was due to the October 7th attacks and all of its reverberations, right? And it had so many more reverberations beyond Israel and the Palestinian territories in the region. Number one, Iran, obviously, that severely weakened Iran. Iran is a severely weakened state. Its axis of resistance, so-called, has now been debilitated. Hamas is severely deteriorated because of Israeli operations, at least for the time being. I know there's questions about long-term viability and what the conditions are there. But more importantly, Hezbollah has been incredibly weakened, which is Iran's kind of main player and its main arm of power projection in the region, because the Iranians, have had this strategy of no war, no peace. And Hezbollah, as its kind of proxy and power projection actor, has allowed them to do that. And with their capabilities deteriorated, they can no longer do that. And obviously, too, in Syria, with the fall of the Assad regime, that also happened recently, they lost an ally there as well. So with Iran, you can kind of see it going one of two ways. Being so severely weakened, its back is up against the wall. Will it be driven to a point where its only course of action is acceleration of its nuclear program? So will it go that way? The other way that it can go is it reads the writing on the wall while its back is against the wall, and it goes through this, period of back-channel diplomacy, so to speak, and take feelers out there, leverage its relationship with Russia, leverage its détente with the Gulf players, particularly Saudi Arabia, to try to do some sort of quiet deal. And obviously a lot of that will depend on which voices will influence most within the Trump administration and which direction wants to go. If I was going to place any bets at this stage about what Iran might do, I would say that it would try the diplomatic route to kind of have a détente with the United States, because there's many within Netanyahu's government in camp that's seeking to bring in the United States into a military operation against Iran. They want to guard against that. Trump has a predisposition to deal making, and also if they were to accelerate their nuclear program, I think there would be enough signals in order for us to pick up on that, where that might backfire. But then, other major regional players, right, that you talked about. So you've got Saudi Arabia. I think if you look at Saudi Arabia, its program of rehabilitation in the international scene, I think, is continuing, again, aided massively by the incoming, or the current now, Trump administration, which has close relationships with the Saudi royal family and MBS in particular. they'll, there's also questions around whether the U.S.-Saudi security deal is going to go forward. It fell apart under the tail end of the Biden administration, but the Saudis could be looking to kind of give a deal and a win to the Trump administration. That'll depend, I think, on any type of potential resolution with around the Palestinian territories. So lots going on there. And then with Turkey, Assad's downfall greatly benefited Turkey, right? So it upped its regional influence because it and Qatar were really the only kind of pro-Islamist, anti-Assad governments within the Middle East consistently. And now they have a leader in Jalani, NHTS, who's a close ally of Turkey. They've seen their influence amp up, which then will mean that they'll pressure the United States and others to tamp down against the Kurds and the SDF forces. But what then that opens up is a competition front with Israel, which again, we don't want to see happening in the region, and the United States doesn't either. So, that whole three-dimensional chess cliche about the Middle East holds true with that one. And then lastly, I'd say with Israel, there's good news and bad news if you're looking at it from an Israeli national security perspective. So put on your hat of, say, like an Israeli national security person. Good news is Hamas, at least at the moment, has been decimated, severely weakened, right? Iran is on the back foot, severely weakened, a huge regional threat. The incoming Trump administration is good for them, right? There's good relations in there. They can push for that maximum pressure campaign in Iran. Bad news is, again, so many of the long-term issues that give rise to Israeli insecurity have not been resolved, namely in the Palestinian territories. And so there's that. And there's the unpredictability of the Trump administration as well. So that's a quick whip around. So covered at least some of it.
Not too shabby, not too shabby. What I'd like to do now, before I hand it over to the audience, is just ask all three of you a series of questions that I think you're all, in different ways, qualified to answer. And the first one is about a sort of meta question about the information environment that we're all operating in. And Jenny, close your ears if you will, but we're talking about the decline of traditional media. You're living it. The rise of new social media channels, only some of which I have personally, in my age group, dipped into. I'm not TikToking very much, I must confess. Of course, the seemingly commercially bizarre decision, but politically perhaps very wise decision of Elon Musk to buy Twitter, now X. We see continued discussions about disinformation and misinformation in the online sphere, and now, of course, the rise of artificial intelligence, which has become, for many people, a daily tool of their work and their research now. So that's a very rough sort of survey of the landscape, but I'd just ask all three of you to maybe reflect on how you do your work in that kind of environment and what you see happening over the next 12 months.
Well, I'm not using AI for my columns yet. Maybe this is a mistake, maybe I should, but I haven't. But I don't think there's any doubt that there is just the most extraordinary change going on in the media. It obviously has been going on for some time, but it's only becoming more and more pronounced, more explosive, and that's going to continue. Oddly, can I just say, in defence of the Financial Review, one of the things that it does do with certain papers, because there's so much information and so much uncertainty about what's true and what's not, at least some people are willing to pay for advice that they trust, in that sense, media that they trust. So strangely, in some ways, it benefits a paper like the Financial Review, this whole morass of social media and things around. But obviously, all the advertising and things, that's all changing dramatically. In terms of AI, again, who would know? I mean, obviously, it's kind of can be of great benefit. People talk about all the productivity benefits. You can hope that will come. And possibly it's because I'm part of the old media, but I also see all the scary factors about it and what it has already done, I think, in terms of splitting society into different groups. You know, the disinformation, the misinformation, that's only going to increase, and increasing that sense of difference and polarisation, and everybody just listening to their own kind of reinforcing their own prejudices.
Before I go to you, Dan, on this, I just intervene because Jenny mentioned that, you know, jokingly, that she's not using AI yet to write her columns. But if you're a writer in this audience, or if you're listening online, one thing I would recommend, if a lot of your stuff is online, your articles, ask ChatGPT or whatever AI engine you're using to critique your work. That is a really interesting exercise.
Oh dear, that sounds dreadful.
Dan, over to you.
It is fun. Look, I'm going to turn it around a little bit and say we've got 100 odd smart, interested people here in the audience, and we've got however many are watching online. And I still have great faith in an engaged citizenship. And while I agree wholeheartedly with Jenny about the dangers of the way in which things become stratified and sped up and online, the social media can create disinformation, that sort of thing. Some of that's not that different, but just a lot faster than when they first invented the printing press, and you started being able to distribute propaganda in that way. An informed citizenry that is willing to come to events like this and then speak to friends, and then from there perhaps get on your social media channels and spread. That is the only antidote for that sort of thing. So I've still got a lot of faith in people to be rational, but at the moment I can't figure out whether or not Panama has decided to release American ships to go through for free, or whether or not the Chinese actually own the whole Panama Canal. Like, that's a sort of example that when you're a long way away, you can't actually work out what's going on in this current media environment.
I'm glad you mentioned the invention of the printing press, by the way, because it's worth remembering that we are less than, I think, 35 years into the invention of the internet. And so anybody at this stage who confidently predicts what this could mean for humanity, I think, is kidding themselves. 35 years after the invention of the printing press, we'd barely begun, you know, the revolution of the printed word. Lydia.
You might ask ChatGPT to critique your pieces, but don't ask it to do a bio of you, because I've asked it to do that one time, and despite many publicly available biographies that I have, it hallucinated all sorts of different stuff. So, which brings me to my point, is that I don't have anything good to say about the information environment right now. I'm generally very optimistic person. I'll try to do that, but with the information environment, it is highly polluted and only getting more so, I think, in the meta sense. And I think if you take a look at AI, generative AI, large language models at the moment, at least in the short term, they've deteriorated the quality of information and text-based communication. The technological environment has completely broken the information environment and polluted it, and to the extent where it has an impact on the areas that I work on, say around democracy and political violence, it has had a lot of deleterious effects. So if you take a look at political violence, disinformation is fueling that. There's a lot of disinformation-fueled political violence at the moment. If you take a look at democracy and having that informed citizenry that Dan is advocating for, we're all advocating for, it's deteriorated that. But more importantly, I think if you take a look at it from a big picture perspective, I think a lot about how it's shattered our consensus reality, our ability to agree on a basic framework of what's what. Our minds are scrambled with that one, and I think it's only going to get worse before it gets better. I think you have some pockets where you have, bespoke positive efforts going on, but I wish I had good things to say about the current information environment. I really don't.
Wow, that's actually pretty remarkable when you think that. Remind me, Lydia, what year was the Arab Spring? That was meant to be the social media-led revolution in the Middle East.
Yep. Yeah. So the Arab Spring, I think, showed us the limitations of freedom of information and access and how it can facilitate those things absent concrete political organizational systems And also the other side of the internet, which, Bill Clinton famously said, and I think you've quoted this a lot as well, Sam, it's like trying to stick Jell-O to a wall in terms of how it can close up autocracy. It's had the opposite effect. I talked about how autocracies can manipulate and take advantage of elections. They do so as well through these open systems and the internet as well. So yeah, a hugely changed landscape. And I think, we talk about how various technological leaps have completely upended society and transformed us. I think the difference now is the speed. The printing press took speed and reach, exactly right. Speed, reach, scale. So I think that point is a bit unprecedented when we're talking about various other technologies and comparing them.
Yeah, but I just would say that I do think it enables people the other way as well. So there are correctives that are put out, and there are opportunities to fact check, and there is a lot of reach that comes out, and the ability to be able to learn about the world from the internet. And yes, you've got to be able to have your filters up, but we're at a greater time in terms of our access to information than we've ever been, and I think that's a good.
I'll just quickly say too, Sam, that none of what's happening now was inevitable. It's not a derivative of the technology itself. It's because there are certain economies at play. There's certain power structures at play. If you take a look at the hold that big tech has in terms of how much power they wield and how those economies work and their business models. So it's not that the technology itself is determinative. It's more about we're in an environment where we've got a handful of people, essentially tech oligarchs, who are controlling at least the social media aspect of it, and potentially with AI as well. And none of that is inevitable. It's just that that's the direction we're going now.
Which also means it's fixable.
Correct.
So second question for all of you, and with an eye on the time, let's not dither over this one. But I mentioned in the introduction, I use this phrase, the parochialism of the present, which is this tendency to believe, this bias that we all have, that the times we are living through are uniquely are just special. In this case, when we're talking about international politics, perhaps uniquely dangerous or uniquely consequential. But if I can ask all three of you to take a step back for a moment and look at this question historically, and it can be difficult given as we were just discussing, the pace of the news. How do you feel about that question? Are we in historically difficult times or dangerous times, or is, as someone once said, is it just one thing after another, as all history is?
Well, I think, if you look back, for example, at the 1960s, where you had, domestic riots, and you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had the Vietnam War, I'm sure that people would feel, that was in many ways an incredibly disruptive time socially. But I think we're not only are we is the equivalent of that happening now and at speed, the fact that everything just travels around the world and everybody's involved instantly, I think makes this actually different, and I think more dangerous.
There's still big parts of the world, though, that are dark. We haven't talked at all. We wouldn't talk at this event about what's happening in Congo, for instance, which has the potential for it to really have a significant cost in human lives, the fighting that's restarted there between Rwanda and the Congo. But it's not that the ramifications that come from that are not going to spread globally.
No, but I do think there's things, whether it's Middle East, nuclear, more players with nuclear power, more players with more dangerous toys, and the ability to then use those alliances instantly, whether it's with greater potency, makes it different.
I think the other thing that is worrisome for this moment, which we haven't talked about much this evening, is climate change, and the prospect that the environment may deteriorate really rapidly around us. So that's something that is very worrisome for this moment. But I do think that we have this tendency to look at the present in a parochial sense and think we've never been challenged like this before.
I've got one hopeful note on climate change for you all, by the way. There is an organisation, I can't remember which country it's in Europe, called Our World in Data, which released some statistics the other day and concluded that globally pollution had peaked, that all the most dangerous forms of pollution were globally were in decline now. So we've at least reached the high water mark in that sense. Lydia.
Well, your question is actually one I think about a lot in my work. It's like, are we getting worse? And I think the answer is an unsatisfactory one, which is it depends on how you look at it. But one of the books that I really turn to about this question is Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness. And he puts together all of these statistics around life expectancy, violence, the risk of a ton of bad things happening, all these measures of human progress. And by all accounts, we're doing great, compared to other elements in human history. But I think, as my fellow panelists have pointed out, you have things like the environmental degradation that we're living with. There's some existential things that we're concerned about, like environmental degradation, like the information environment and AI. So it depends, so I think we're facing some really severe challenges. And also, because of the information environment, we are so much more aware now of everything around us. I think back in the day, even if you go back 30 years ago, we were not so aware of all of the world's problems. Not only aware, but feeling like we're connected to them or have to respond to them, and then feeling helpless and disenfranchised when we can't. So I think that contributes to that feeling. So.
Great answer. Look, final little survey question before I open it up to the audience. What's your black swan for this year? What's an issue that we haven't talked about yet, a sort of sleeper issue that you think is going to be big in 2025? I'll say mine very briefly, which is the potential for a Trump grand bargain with a foreign adversary. Could be Russia over Ukraine, it could be North Korea over nuclear weapons, or it could be China over Taiwan. That's a prospect that won't please the Taiwanese, but which may, be over the long term quite beneficial for regional stability. So the possibility of a grand bargain, that's my black swan for this year. Jenny, what about you?
I guess I was thinking about this, because of course a black swan by definition means you can't predict it, but because I was thinking, well, COVID, like we had another epidemic, and I thought actually in many ways we have learnt quite a lot about how to handle an epidemic. Maybe we wouldn't make some of the same mistakes we made before. But in terms of a black swan event, I guess North Korea's gone quiet. I'm less optimistic about a grand deal involving North Korea and Trump, and more about actually some terrible accident. They decide to, not accident, sorry, to fire something off, a nuclear weapon of some, and Japan, who knows? But I think that is kind of quite a dangerous part of the world we've forgotten about for a couple, not forgotten, but it's been overwhelmed for the last couple of years, and it's still there, simmering.
Dan?
I reckon, I thought about this, and I've got so many that I wanted to it's just the worst possible things that you can imagine. So there's so many. Mine would be something like a big chunk of Antarctica breaking off, and it becoming the catalyst for people to really start paying attention to climate issues again. So if you remember with the Australian fires, it actually had a big political impact in the United States just before COVID hit and blew everything away. But there was this, Australia is burning. The 2020 fires, the Black Saturday fires, were a wake-up call that radicalised people around climate issues. And so I think that there's this sense of, in the community, that something is not quite right with the world and with the climate, and it wouldn't take much to really worry people around this issue, or turn it into a real I don't want to say battleground, because that implies violence, but it could have to do with moving refugees. A massive cyclone in Bangladesh, for instance, could drive people, and then you get refugee movements, climate refugees that are heading out, and then all the sensitivities that become as a result of that.
I think that unfortunately the most obvious thing in 2025 though is not the concerns about climate change, but the concerns about cost and reliability of energy, which is moving against that.
Right, and it's interesting though, because the environment issue though is inherently a conservative issue. It's about conservation, and so I think that while Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's caught up in this economic aspect of how much are we willing to pay for it. But I think there's something in all that. The other thing I'd just say really quickly is Donald Trump, the lame duck. So I think, you know, Donald Trump might well be a goose, but at the moment he is at his most powerful point. And I think if you look at the experience that there's been in the United States, this is assuming that he can't run again and doesn't try and fiddle the Constitution and get himself into a third term. But he's also 78. He could just drop dead. I'm being a bit nasty. But Donald Trump, the lame duck, if you think back to 2000, those of you who've been around for a while, think back to 2004 when George W. Bush won that 2004 election. He was at the peak of his power then. And a year later, after Katrina, the cyclone that hit in New Orleans, Bush, yes, he still had an impact in foreign policy issues, but politically at home, it was very difficult for him. Because even under Trump and MAGA, I still think that that ability for people to try and feather their nests, figure out what's their next job, that's going to be there. And who's going to take over from Donald Trump? Because he's a kind of unique character. It's not going to be JD Vance, I don't think. He doesn't sort of carry in that same way. And vice presidents don't do well in US elections historically either. So I think Trump is a lame duck.
Well, Dan stole my black swan idea, which is a dead duck, potentially deceased Donald Trump. As Dan mentioned, he's old, but also the degree of political violence in the United States now is relatively very high. We've had one assassination attempt against him. And so what happens, A, if he gets assassinated, or if he dies, given his age and condition, what's all that going to mean? I mean, he's an unpredictable character, but we've been moving along a trajectory of him around. And then that's going to just create a black hole, I think, in the global environment, an untimely passing while he's in office of Trump, and we'll have all sorts of reverberations.
Okay, a direction I was not expecting, but very interesting. There's a microphone roaming. Put your hand up, please, if you'd like to ask a question, and then wait for the mic, if you wouldn't mind. Gentleman in the colourful shirt. Is that why you wore it, so I wouldn't miss you?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks very much, everybody, and I enjoy the venue, and thank you very much for coming to Melbourne, Lowry. Right. My question really was around NATO. So if you stand back, NATO looks like it's more powerful than it's been in decades, right? It's got more members, it's commitments from all of its members that it's going to spend more money, it's got a visible threat on its doorstep, and yet when you read about it, everyone's much more pessimistic and feel that it's weaker and in fact less influential than it's been perhaps for a long time as well. So none of the panellists mentioned it, perhaps because it's not Australia as such, but it's still the largest military alliance out there. So any reflections?
Shall I have a go at that one? Well, only to say that Trump is hardly unique among American presidents in encouraging, cajoling European NATO members into spending more for their defence, but he may be the only one that's actually prepared to back it up by calling the bluff of the Europeans and withdrawing some forces or withdrawing some kind of support. There are already some indications that the Europeans themselves believe this. More of them are taking their defence spending seriously. It's probably not enough, but it will, in the European way, it will haltingly and slowly get there. It's worth remembering that the European economies put together are still 10 times larger than the Russian economy. So there's a severe imbalance there in favour of the NATO powers and the European powers. All they need to do is get their act together. That means not just spending more, but consolidating European defence industries. And that's nowhere near to happening. So there's a job of work still to do, but I'm less pessimistic than some who would, who see a scenario of, well, Ukraine today, the rest of, the Central Europe tomorrow, and then so on and so on, salami tactics. It seems to me the imbalance of power between Europe and Russia is so severe that, and particularly the Russians having been severely weakened now by their Ukraine adventure, that's not going to happen. We have time for one more. Do we have a hand up? Please, just wait for the microphone.
This is more of a statement than a question, I think, but I would be interested in your thoughts. So backing up on the technological revolution, from a philosophical perspective, whenever there's a revolution, sorry, not the technological, the AI revolution, I guess we could call it, with a new zeitgeist, there is a period of chaos, and I see what we're entering into now as this period of chaos, and particularly with Trump and Musk sitting side by side, and then bringing in there factors such as the idea of the decay of democracy, and then the ideas of capitalism, feudal capitalism. And obviously this is moving on to a worldview and not so much necessarily the Australian context, but it does worry me. I think, Dan, you were being very optimistic about people being able to connect and talk and be rational, but I really wonder with the AI situation and the technological revolution whether we really can overcome this new zeitgeist.
Anyone like to respond? Personally, I'm just as optimistic as Dan, and I think AI does promise many productivity improvements that are going to make our lives better.
I'm going to tell a quick little story. Granny Flitton turned 100 in December. This is my grandmother. She still lives on her own. She still drives a car. She sends me text messages on the family WhatsApp with emojis. So if Granny can cope with developing technologies, I reckon the rest of us can too.
Well, I think the question, Sam, just maybe, we talked about our various impressions about whether optimism or pessimism around that, but one of the things we didn't really touch on was the geopolitics of AI, and I think that's going to be a huge thing moving forward. So we saw with the fanfare around DeepSeek coming out, there's going to be limitations around what the United States can do in terms of tech controls with China. So, and right now, as we speak, Paris is hosting the Global AI Summit. Macron and Narendra Modi are co-sponsoring that summit. So the geopolitics of AI is going to be huge, I think, going forward. And I think we're at the tail end of a very narrowly kind of closing window of setting some cooperation around global norms and cooperation with AI. And I think it's fast closing. And if it does, then we're going to really start to see this cooperation heat up.
And I also think, just on that point, this has been happening obviously for a long time, but what's been most striking, or one of the things that's struck me, is how much it can be used for social control in countries like China, which it has been, to reward and punish.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are now over time officially, so I'm sorry, I'm going to have to close it off there. To our online audience, thank you, and to everyone here at the State Library, thank you so much for joining us today, and would you please thank our panellists?